We are on course for the Chancellor not being able to meet her fiscal commitments come the autumn. And I think that pretty much has to mean tax increases. I think the government has trapped themselves in a corner and they don't quite know where to go.
This is that old school cultishness and defensiveness around the NHS. They're not trying to convince anyone that they have a plan to do anything positive.
The national debt is about 100% of GDP. We spend over 100 billion a year on debt interest. Borrowing costs are extremely high. The level of taxation is at generational high. Things are pretty miserable. Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications here, and today I am joined by our Executive Director, Tom Clougherty, and our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz. Now, before we dive in, the usual plug for our Substack. If you want to hear more from us, go to insider.iea.org.uk, where you'll find all of our blogs, publications, podcasts, events, and more. Now, this week is a spending review extravaganza. I'm sure you were all as excited as we were, on the edge of your seats watching Rachel Reeves deliver the spending review for this Parliament, the long-awaited spending review. Tom, let's just dive straight into it. What were your main takeaways from this week?
I mean, well done for trying to make it sound exciting. It probably isn't the best thing to say at the beginning of a podcast about the spending review, but my goodness, it was boring. The review itself was boring. The speech was really boring. And, you know, I won't blame the Chancellor for her style of delivery and everything like that. That would be a bit unfair. But just in terms of the content, it was reeling off meaningless numbers with no context. And you couldn't really get from the speech she gave in the House of Commons any real sense of the top lines. What was actually going on in this spending review? You heard about money for some high street somewhere and some other project over here, but it was all this random stuff and no real narrative. And I think maybe that underlines the fact that there isn't a real narrative. I mean, I've said this before, that I think the government has trapped themselves in a corner and they don't quite know where to go. And that's why there's no real sort of clear, shining message that comes out of this, however hard they might try. But okay, let me attempt to bring a little bit of coherence to this. It was really a similar story in many respects to what we've seen over the past however many years. More money for the NHS and a squeeze on day-to-day spending budgets pretty much everywhere else. Some departments suffering more than others. Maybe what was a little new was a big boost to capital spending. Now, the government talks this up as though it's going to do something for economic growth. Mostly, though, the capital spending doesn't have much to do with economic growth at all. The lion's share of it is going towards defence. We might think that's a good thing, but it's not necessarily a clear economic benefit. Otherwise, to net zero, I think regular listeners will know what I think about that. And sort of general capital spending for public services. All of this stuff may be good, it may be necessary, but it's not really pro-growth capital expenditure. So that would be my top line. More money for the NHS, a squeeze everywhere else, and more capital spending, but not the kind of capital spending that I think is likely to deliver a lot of economic growth. The thing to say about the squeeze on day-to-day spending, I have no problem with that. Squeeze away. I mean, let's cut. Let's not just have modest real terms increases. Let's start cutting back government. But I think it was so telling that this has been talked up as kind of a zero-based review where they were thinking things through from first principles. It was nothing of the sort. The IFS have identified something pretty funny, I think, that for all of the talk of zero base, pretty much every department is getting the same cuts to the admin budget each year. So this was classic salami slicing. There was no thinking whatsoever about what the government does, whether it needs to do it, whether it can do it differently, whether it should be done by the private sector instead. This is, in a sense, the same mistake that I think the Conservatives made in government, of just trying to gradually shave off a little bit more, without changing what the state was expected to do. And ultimately, that is almost bound just to lead to a degradation of services and to people getting more and more fed up and provoking a kind of backlash eventually. Yes, let's cut, but you have to reform at the same time.
I think it's interesting, though, that the spending restraint that was announced for sort of the next few years has to be viewed in the context of the first 2 years, what they call phase one of the spending review, which is where they went up dramatically. So between 24, when this government came in, and the start of this parliament and the end of this parliament, most departments are still getting real-term increases to their budgets, right?
Yeah, that's true. And it was interesting that most of the figures that Rachel Reeves did reel off during her speech were covering a 5-year period, 2 of the years which were already kind of in the rearview mirror. And that, from their perspective, made the numbers look a lot better because they appeared to be more generous towards the public services and so on. But yeah, I mean, it is a little bit dispiriting. It's not surprising, of course, but the degree to which spending is just viewed as a good thing. And it was quite interesting and maybe a slight change of tone for the government, actually, to hear Rachel Reeves really defending the tax increases they made at the budget last year, where previously they've been kind of apologetic for it, and trying to say, we've made these big tax increases so we can put more money into public services. And, you over there, Reform, and you over there, the Tories, wouldn't have done that. Boo you. Yeah, fine. But it's not very compelling, frankly. It's a mixed message at best.
It's telling that what was touted as one of the biggest speeches of the entire Parliament, it was just in the way they chose to deliver it was just a list of spending pledges. That shows how much they just think that actually all the voters care about is how much more money we can spend. It's not about outcomes. It's not about our vision for the country. It's just who gets pots of money where, which is why the Chancellor ended up talking about high streets in Clougherty, etc., etc. Kristian, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, specifically on the NHS, I'm not really surprised. The NHS is getting another 3% in real terms every year. But what's more telling about this than the raw number itself is that this completely shows that they've given up on any kind of reform agenda there. So Wes Streeting, initially as Shadow Health Secretary, presented himself as a radical reformer, as somebody who isn't afraid to challenge a consensus and make enemies within his own camp, and he did. So the Corbynista wing of his own party, for them, he was a hate figure for a while. So Streeting and Starmer himself also, they repeatedly said, look, the idea of NHS being the envy of the world is not true. They also said we can't just keep throwing money at it. And then I noticed at the last, at the local elections, they went back to the old NHS cultishness. So they handed out this leaflet, which was a mock hospital bill and showing a doctor with a credit card reader, and the message being, vote for us because this is what the other guys want to do to you. And this is that old school cultishness and defensiveness around the NHS. They're not trying to convince anyone that they have a plan to do anything positive. It's more about appealing to the sacred cow status of the NHS and trying to big that up and weaponize it for themselves. Yeah. And in a way, the chapter on health reform in the spending review is just the logical conclusion of that. So they're saying precisely what they said initially they weren't going to do, which was to just throw money at it. That's what they're doing now. Another 3% every year in real terms. And this is, even though, there's been the big COVID injection, obviously, which has never been reversed. So it only went about halfway or so back to where it was before the COVID increase. And we are now in the global top 10 when it comes to public or statutory healthcare spending as a proportion of GDP. With those extra increases, we'll probably go into the top 5 by the end of the parliament. And what they're doing when it comes to reform, to call it that, is really just, it's the old platitudes. Prevention is better than cure. Purely in terms of cost, that's not really true. You don't really save much through preventive care, and even where you do, it's not quite clear what this would mean. How do you do that? It's often about changing lifestyles, public health stuff, nanny state measures, and there you're basically shifting all the attention away from doing anything on the health front. There you're basically telling people you should stop eating chocolate bars or whatever, rather than putting the burden on the users rather than the service itself. And then there's the old shibboleths about we'll digitalize the service, we'll use more computers and whatever, or now they talk about AI as well. Okay, I'm not against technology. It's just that the trouble is the question that we should always start from is, why do we need ministers why do we need anyone in Whitehall telling individual actors, whether it's in the health service or other parts of the public sector, to do things more efficiently? So nobody comes around here and tells us you should use this technology, because we just have an interest in making good use of the scant resources that we have. And if there's a technology that enables us to do that, we use it. And we may sometimes overlook it, but if there's an obvious low-hanging fruit, well, there isn't, because we would have plucked it already. So why does this not happen in the NHS? Why do individual organizations within the NHS, why do they not use technologies that are available to them? And that's the question they should ask, rather than just going around saying, oh, you're going to use an AI program and you're going to use some new communication tool and whatever. So, yeah, and then of course, there's the care in the community is an old slogan again, where governments have always been saying this, going back to certainly the Blair years, probably well before then. The idea being, rather than sending everyone to hospital, let's have more things, more low-key, lower-tier interventions. Again, good in the abstract, but you need a mechanism to deliver all that, which exists in some other systems. For example, in Switzerland, they have this system where you agree to have telephone consultations first, or going to an integrated network in your area first, before going to an expensive specialist. You get all kinds of discounts on your health insurance premiums, and that's the way to incentivize that sort of behavior. Whereas here we just have a politician in Whitehall at the national level saying, oh, wouldn't it be good if we used the service in a more rational, efficient way? But we don't have any tools on the ground where that just happens. And so I'm not impressed, but not surprised either.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm struck. I think it's true for the NHS, and it's true for all of the other things we were talking about, sort of local transport projects and stuff, or not even transport projects necessarily, but the ludicrous degree of over-centralisation that we have in Britain, and the idea that this is something that should form part of a major fiscal statement, just seems wrong. I was also quite struck by the real venom with which the Chancellor kind of spat the words insurance-based across the divide in the House of Commons towards reform, because supposedly, Nigel Farage has talked in the past about maybe Britain should have a social insurance healthcare system like some European countries. And as you said at the recent local election campaigns, the government was trying to spin that as though, if everyone was going to have to pay massive bills out of pocket for healthcare if reform were elected. But it's worth saying this again, and I know we say it on here quite a lot, but you know who has insurance-based healthcare systems in France, Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, really most European countries that have healthcare systems that perform better than ours? This is just childish if we're using the word insurance as a term of abuse. It's sort of sad, pathetic politics, basically. And I think it does show, as Kristian has put it quite well, just a government that's maybe finding itself trapped between a difficult fiscal situation where they want to spend more, but taxes are already high, the deficit's already high, hard to see what breaks there, and then backbenchers who will really be pushing for more money for public services, more money for public sector employees and everything else. And so they're just lapsing back on the kind of easy win lines for their own supporters. Yeah.
It's another good indicator of them caring more about the inputs than the outputs, with the comparison to the better healthcare systems that are insurance-based, by just saying we're going to spend more and more and more and more. By the end of the Parliament, Resolution Foundation put it that it'll be almost 50% of day-to-day government spending will be on the NHS. They said the UK is becoming a national health state. Is there any end to this?
I can't see it yet. Going back for a moment to using insurance-based in this way as if it was some kind of dystopia. And you know who else has an insurance-based tier? Not the whole system, but a major element of it. It's Australia, where Wes Streeting went on what he called a fact-finding mission. This trip where he went to Australia and Singapore, it's not it wasn't in itself super useful because I don't know what did he think he would find there. It's if he wants to know something about how those systems operate, you can just Google it. But nonetheless,
a very nice IEA paper.
We could write IEA publications if we wanted to. Yeah, but I mean the thing is, by doing that, it's not that he hoped that he would find out any facts that he couldn't otherwise find out, but it was a signal. It was a way of saying, look, I'm looking for bold reform ideas, and I'm traveling around. I'm open-minded about it. That was his whole pitch. And one of the things that Australia has, and he wasn't positive about that aspect specifically, but he did clearly not see it as a terrible system on the whole. And one of the things that they, where they stand out is that even though they have a state insurer, okay, we could call that insurance-based too, they have a national insurer, but they have on top of that, more than half of the population in Australia also have private insurance on top of that. And that is specifically incentivized through the tax system, where the idea being that if you have private insurance, you use the public insurer less, and we recognize that through the tax system. And I've written about it, saying the way they do it isn't ideal. It's not exactly how I would do it, but nonetheless, the basic idea is the correct one. And so by going there, he was showing, at least he was signaling a willingness to look at alternative mechanisms of financing and delivering healthcare. And going back to this old school rhetoric, it clearly marks where it shows that they've given up on that strategy. Basically, they thought, well, we'll give it a go for a year or two, but they just find it easier to retreat basically into their comfort zone and draw up these horror scenarios and saying, vote with us. We are the only thing that protects you from what these other bad guys have in store for you. So there's that. And on the spending side, I was also not surprised to see that I looked up the King's Fund's response to the budget. And they said, yes, this is a good start, but it's obviously not enough. And I thought, I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. No matter how what the spending pledges are specifically, someone somewhere is always going to say, that's not good enough.
Yeah. I mean, traditionally, of course, healthcare inflation does run above the rate of economy-wide inflation. So, I mean, there's sort of some justification for that sense that it's never enough, especially when you have such weak productivity in healthcare as we've experienced since the pandemic. And I think that's got to be the big question here is, does putting that extra money into the NHS do anything to improve outcomes? I don't think anybody actually thinks that the government is going to be able to meet its targets on NHS improvement, even with this extra cash. I think fundamentally, we're not disagreeing here. Cash is not the answer. Cash might be helpful, but ultimately it has to be about real structural reforms if they want to change the outcomes in a meaningful and lasting way. And I still hope maybe they'll come back to it. I mean, you can't expect everything to be embodied in a spending review. Maybe Wes Streeting, the health secretary, will surprise us and come up with some radical reform plans later in the parliament or something. We'll see. And it's worth bearing in mind, I mean, Tony Blair's government sort of went completely the wrong direction from my perspective on public services initially in 1997, and then became a very sort of pro-reform, pro-choice, pro-marketisation force later on. So I don't want to write them off altogether, but it's clear that in many respects the signs are not encouraging based on this spending review.
I think that's a fair point, though. We are assessing their whole programme through the lens of the spending review this week. In their defence, there is other stuff going on. There was the story on the front page of the Times on the day of the spending review made that exact point, that even with extra money, not expected to hit the waiting list targets. But the government's defence was quite reasonably, we never said it was just about money.
Yeah.
There is going to be reform alongside this as well. It's just the focus this week has been on the money for obvious reasons. Now, that still comes with a heavy degree of scepticism from us and from many others, but it is something they're at least paying lip service to, which is some bit of hope to hold on to. I'd like to take a bit of a zoom out now and have a look at the sort of at this in the round and the overall state of the economy and what we think it might do to it. Today, there's been some GDP figures come out for April, which showed the economy shrunk by 0.3%. But as Tom, you've mentioned in the past, it's little bits of up and down are a bit irrelevant. The point is basically zero.
Yeah.
But also the other bits of context here are the national debt is about 100% of GDP. We spend over 100 billion a year on debt interest. Borrowing costs are extremely high. The taxation, the level of taxation is at generational high. Things are pretty miserable. But it doesn't seem like anybody in positions of power has grasped that reality properly yet.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty clear, actually. You've summed it up well. We have high spending. We have a lot of debt. We have a lot of debt interest. We're running a deficit. Growth is low. Taxes are high. This is just not a happy scenario for anyone to be in. And nothing that's happening seems likely to change that. And again, you can't expect too much from a spending review. After all, it is all about just laying out spending totals. But, people were talking a lot in the run-up to the spending review about, well, given that debt interest costs have increased, given that the economy seems to have weakened, the headroom that the Chancellor has against her fiscal rules for the autumn has probably gone and then some, and so we're looking at another fiscal black hole. People seem to disagree about how big it is. I've heard numbers up to about 60 billion. I've heard smaller numbers as well. Obviously, this is compounded by reversing course on the winter fuel payment. Supposedly there's going to be some other rowing back on the welfare cuts that they'd announced previously. So there are all sorts of things which are pointing in the direction of the fiscal rules not being met unless there are tax increases coming in the autumn. And so people were saying, well, maybe she'll cut spending back more than we expect, more than the previously announced spending totals. That didn't happen. So we are at the moment on course, especially with this new economic news. We are on course for the Chancellor not being able to meet her fiscal commitments come the autumn. And I think that pretty much has to mean, obviously I don't want this to happen, but from their perspective, it's going to mean tax increases. Or they abandon the fiscal rules or they rewrite them. Now that's always possible. I think there's almost no way they're not going to continue this long-term freeze in tax allowances and thresholds. I'd be astonished if there was any change there. But I don't think that's going to be enough. Maybe that saves them about 10 billion. If this fiscal black hole really is up to 60 or at least 45 or something, they're going to need to look elsewhere. And, Angela Rayner had that list of potential tax increases that she was supposedly circulating. Miraculously, it found its way out to the newspapers. But they're all pretty small beer. A lot of those suggestions were things which, probably might have some negative economic consequences as well, wouldn't necessarily raise a lot of money. In general, just degrade the quality of our tax system, if we can really talk about the quality of our tax system anymore. Not a term I would normally use, right? But I don't think even all of that stuff, if they did it, would be enough. So I don't want to depress people. Maybe things will pick up over the summer. I'm sure that this is what in the Treasury they're longing for, some good economic news which changes the picture. But it does look to me like we're going to endure a summer of speculation about what taxes are going to go up and by how much, and can they really honour their commitment not to raise income tax, national insurance, although they've already broken that one, and VAT. It doesn't seem all that likely to me. As I've said already, they're boxed in, and I just don't really see the impetus or the initiative to change the weather at all.
Yeah, well, there's one area, of course, and we've talked about this many times before, which would be an easy one for growth impetus. And they've mentioned it again in this review as well. I've had a look at their housing section where they repeat once again that figure from that OBR report, where they're saying, because of the government's changes where they've increased housing targets and their so-called grey belt reforms, relatively minor stuff so far, but even so, it's enough to raise the growth rate by 1/5 of a percentage point by the end of the decade. They've repeated that figure again, so seemingly quite proud of it, and then go on to say, and here's what we'll do next. Here's another, I can't remember, but tens of billions over the next 10 years on social housing, which makes you wonder, okay, this is the one area where this is basically this is the magic money tree or the magic growth tree, right? Where there you can get a few. Well, I mean, if you did it properly, probably more than a percentage point of growth, and out of it, without any obvious downside. So this should be the easy part of it. And rather than doubling down on it, this is what they've chosen to throw money at. So, I mean, if there's one sector that clearly doesn't need subsidies in this country, it's housing, because it's already the case that for pretty much anything you can build anywhere, the money you can make from that, the value that you generate in that way is a multiple of the cost. So there's so much obvious pent-up demand. Why you would throw money at that sector in particular, completely beyond me.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the basics of how markets work, right? And the price signal works. Where would the private sector build houses where prices are high? Because you can see that demand is outstripping supply and there's a profit opportunity there. Instead, what we get from the government as their big splash in the newspapers on the morning of the spending review was, 39 billion for social and affordable housing in parts of the country, in many cases, where I think there are a lot of empty properties where actually build costs don't necessarily cover the sale cost doesn't necessarily cover the build cost. Basically, where development isn't viable, they're going to pour money for limited economic gain, where you have this incredible opportunity just to relax the planning system and allow development where it desperately wants to go. And that, they talk about it. And I still have some hope that they will get there. But it's slow going. And I gotta be honest, I did probably expect more quicker on that front. Because after all, if you want to generate significant economic benefits from development, it does take time, right? It doesn't happen overnight. All of these projects take a while to go through the system and stuff. So if this government was really focused on growth the way they've talked about being focused on growth and the way they talked about it before they came into office, I think they would have been going hell for leather for a lot of deregulatory measures where it fit with their broader political project, right? We would want them to deregulate the labour market. They're unlikely to do that given where they come from. We'd probably want them to liberalise the energy sector. Again, very committed to net zero. But on something like housing and planning, where they've said the right things, and it seems to be entirely in their political interests to do it, it is frustrating that instead we're talking about affordable and social housing in areas of frankly low demand.
I am starting to get a little bit fed up of their prophetising about growth being their number one mission.
Yeah.
You spoke about it multiple times about the impact of the tax rises, and employment statistics that came out this week showed that it has fallen faster than it has since COVID, level of employment, that is. We've talked about the Employment Rights Bill, plenty, zero legislation and rules, plenty. But also today, what you've mentioned about where the capital expenditure is going on defence and on social housing, not necessarily all well and good potentially, but not necessarily growth focused. The tweaking of the Green Book rules.
Yeah.
Okay. There's arguments to do that for levelling up reasons or whatever you call it now. But again, not a growth target. And where they are, as you say, where they are focused on growth, or where growth and their political interests align, which should be on planning, they're just not going remotely as fast as they could or should.
Yeah. And we've talked about this before. We've hoped that even if the government, they weren't necessarily kind of, supply side liberalisers in their heart and soul, they might nonetheless be forced into it by circumstance, because it is effectively the only way out of the fiscal trap that they find themselves in, of high taxes, high spending, low growth. You've got to get the economy going, and supply side reform it doesn't have a fiscal cost, right? The private sector is doing the work for you. But it doesn't seem to be happening. And I don't know where the lack of urgency comes from necessarily. It may be just that because they don't really believe in it, they're having a hard time translating intentions into policy. I don't know. But yeah, you look at all of the economic news, and so it's not just the growth figures you said today. As you said, it's the employment figures. Everything is pointing in a negative direction at the moment. We don't want to sound too dreary on here, do we? This is going to be one of our more depressing podcasts in recent times. But it doesn't feel like there's been a lot of sources for optimism this week. And look, I always thought that this was going to be a pretty bad year economically. But I think some of the things that the government has done and is planning to do, so the tax rises last year, the employment rights stuff coming in, it's just going to make matters worse.
What about one, just before we do wrap up, and to try and put a bit of positivity in, the money for nuclear energy this week that was announced as part of the spending review is quite a lot, and is more than the Tories did. Is there hope there, Kristian, that they've got the right end of the stick on energy in one sense?
Well, at least they seem to agree with us that energy is a good thing and that it should be cheaper. But again, they just cannot get out of this mindset that you get there by throwing money at it. So it's a bit like with infrastructure. We talked about this last time. A lot of infrastructure projects are probably good and should happen, but the first question that we need to ask is always why is it more expensive to do this here than it would be in an otherwise similar economy? You know, what's the big difference? What explains that? It's not that the overall level of spending is too low. It's that we don't get enough tarmac, not enough rail track, whatever the project is, for a given unit of spending. And something like that is true in nuclear as well, that generating nuclear energy is more expensive here than in most other economies. And this has been, nobody took the decision that there was no turning point at which some politicians said, I want to make nuclear energy really extremely expensive and make it almost impossible to build new nuclear reactors. It's just a cumulative process where, initially Britain was a world leader on nuclear energy and not even so long ago. So some people's living memory. And it's really just that they're not asking these more fundamental questions. How do we get the unit cost down? Okay, a pro-energy, pro-nuclear attitude, better than nothing, but nonetheless, not the way I would approach it.
No, and we really don't want the government picking winners, if at all possible. We want kind of tech neutrality and then to let the price system flourish. Now, we're a long way away from that in energy at the moment. So I think you can say, okay, well, this is maybe better than nothing. But again, I think it's the wrong approach. And you know what I think was interesting is there was reference in the Chancellor's speech to securonomics. And in the supporting documents from the Treasury, they talked about an agile state. And I think you can see in that terminology the kind of agenda that the Chancellor at least really wishes she was pursuing in government. And it's kind of like Bidenomics. They want to be big spending, entrepreneurial statists. They want new industrial policy. They want government to be very active in commercial spheres and sort of collaborating with steering the private sector. The problem is they can't do it without any money. I'm not bemoaning that fact. I would hate for them to be doing those things, just to be clear. But I think again, I keep saying they're trapped, but nothing really adds up. It isn't a coherent agenda because what they want to do, I think they recognise that they can't really do, and they're left with something which is neither here nor there. Possibly a mix which pleases nobody, from their own backbenchers to the general public, doesn't do much for economic growth, doesn't do much for the fiscal situation, and ultimately, I think is just going to really keep dragging their whole governing project down. One assumes that there will come a break point where they will just say, no, we have to shake things up, things have to change. It's got off to a bad start, but we've still got however many years of this parliament left. You assume that's coming, but I don't know when, and I don't know what it will look like or if it'll be any good.
Well,
by then they were meant to be optimistic. Well,
yeah, we did try.
It's going to be great, Callum. Yeah.
But that's the stuff you have to do right at the start, when you still have some political capital.
Yeah.
And not when you've wasted it on the most pointless imaginable things.
On winter fuel payments and then subsequent U-turn. Yeah, well, like we said, we did try to end positively, unfortunately failed, but we'll try again next week. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, check us out on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Thank you very much.